Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Wednesday, the 8th day of June in the year 2016. It is absolutely a gorgeous day, a little bit cool actually, but super low humidity and just an absolutely delightful day out there, and looks like we're going to get a few more, but very honestly, it appears that the weather, at least in the eastern part of the country, is looking pretty good for the next couple of days. I want to welcome you to this, our third program this week here at the Virtual Center. Obviously, this will be our last broadcast of the week, and we have a number of issues, and I have a number of issues that I'd like to share. I hope we get a chance to get some of them in at least. But before we go through the housekeeping duties of phone numbers and email addresses and things, I wanted to apologize for running over yesterday's program at the very end, at the top of the hour at 3 p.m. I totally lost cognizance of the time. I had checked the time. I knew I had about 8 minutes left. And then I got into a little bit of the stuff with Smedley Butler, if you remember. And suddenly the next time I glanced at the clock, it was 3 minutes after the hour, and I kind of panicked and kind of ran out at the last minute, just thanked everybody and took off. And Bob had told me that today when we were chatting before I went on the air that I probably should have taken the time to complete the thought that I had, that those, a minute here and there is not that critical, his position is. But I didn't know that. I assumed that there was another program that came right on at 3, and I wanted to get out of the way and not create a log jam, if you will, or a traffic jam, on the Head On Radio Network on a Tuesday. But, anyway, I do want to apologize for that. I'll go back, and at the beginning of our program today, I will go back and kind of touch and make a couple of concluding comments about that particular issue, because I do believe it's a very significant one. It obviously got my attention because I lost track of the time. But anyway, I do invite you to participate in our program by picking up the phone and giving us a call. We have a phone number that is reserved specifically for the purpose of giving you access to the air so that you can share your thoughts and your ideas with us on some of the issues we're dealing with here. Obviously, with the California and various other primaries yesterday, there were 6 of them. I think in the Democratic column, I think Hillary won 4 of them, and of course one of them was California, and that obviously is very significant. But I do invite you to share your thoughts and your ideas with us on the air. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you are a little bit reluctant to go on the air, but at the same time would like to share your thought or your comment, ideas with me, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And I do really encourage you to check out our Facebook page. I've become pretty proficient in trying to avail myself of the opportunity to put something on our Facebook page most days. I did this morning. I reacted to a column in the New York Times this morning by Tom Friedman, and I'd like to maybe open with that because it won't take long. But I did want to. It's a pretty good way to get into to the campaign as it's currently going and all of that. So I do want to share that with you. And if you go to our Facebook page, the link to Tom Friedman's article is there, along with some comments I made about it. And again, I'd like to open with that. But again, there's quite a bit on our Facebook page. I've taken to putting one posting at least, sometimes two, occasionally even three different items on Facebook over the last couple of weeks. So the Facebook page is getting some attention. And I still get encouraged because each morning when I fire up the computer, one of the first things I look at is Facebook. Mainly what I'm looking for is reaction from people. And one of the things I've noticed is I continue to get looks and likes on the Facebook page for the Virtual Center. And what that indicates to me is that we continue to attract almost daily one or two new folks or folks that are particularly taken with one of the postings that has appeared on our Facebook page. And I'm very encouraged by that. And I want to thank you because I know many of these folks are listeners and followers of the program and supporters of Bob Kincaid's efforts at the Head On Radio Network over the years. And I do want to thank you for that. You probably do know that this weekend, here in West Virginia, the Democratic Party is holding its state convention. And I've been chosen to be one of the delegates to that convention. And so the last part of this week, Friday and Saturday, I'll be spending a good portion of my time up in Charleston. And I'd like to share a couple of thoughts about that with you today as well. I did mention at the very beginning that there are a number of items today, I think, and I wanted to share them with you all at once. And of course, I guess the first comment or the first issue that I would address, of course, is yesterday's results in the election. Today, obviously, is a reflection day for Bernie Sanders. The media reported last night that he was flying back from California to Vermont, and that he was spending today in Vermont. But on the other hand, he would be in Washington, D.C. tomorrow campaigning for next Tuesday's primary there. And as far as the Democrats are concerned, that is the last one. It's over, and there's 20 delegates there, so it won't materially affect the final outcome of the election. And of course, there is still the issue of the number of delegates pledged delegates as opposed to the superdelegates. And I mentioned that here I am changing my agenda. I give you an agenda and then immediately change it. But this seems to flow logically into that. I mentioned the state Democratic convention here in West Virginia this weekend and the fact that I would be there. One of the issues on that agenda clearly is going to be the issue of superdelegates. And last night we had a meeting, a short meeting, which was really a preliminary meeting to the state convention. And basically the purpose of it was to make sure that we had all of our bases covered, that we had all the delegates appointed and all the alternates appointed. And we were also looking for a couple of people to volunteer to serve on particular committees at the convention, one of them dealing with resolutions. And clearly there's some indication that there's probably going to be some contention at the convention over the issue of resolutions, because word is that one of the resolutions that's going to be raised relates to the issue of superdelegates in the Democratic Party. And I made a few comments at the preliminary meeting last night, and I kind of told myself afterwards that I would share these with you because I do believe all of this is relevant. It really ties in with the issue of representative government, the nature of the republic, the issue of political equality in our society, the extent to which government ought to follow the will of the people, in this case, the will of the voters, or whether in fact there are a group of people that ought to be considered or singled out as being above and therefore not directed by the voters. Many of you will recall that we've been through primary after primary, it seems, and each Tuesday for several months now. And here in West Virginia, in the Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders won the state. And what that means is that the pledged delegates from West Virginia are pledged to support Bernie Sanders on the first ballot at the convention in Philadelphia in late July. But there are also superdelegates from West Virginia, and they are not committed to support Bernie Sanders. In fact, one of the event that happened yesterday in my case was I received a solicitation in the mail yesterday from a candidate, from a Democrat, who is soliciting votes to be a superdelegate, to be a delegate to the national convention at Philadelphia, pledged to support Hillary Clinton. And I'll be honest with you, that created a little bit of a problem for me, because Bernie Sanders did win the state of West Virginia. In other words, the Democratic voters in West Virginia, and we do realize that there were a lot of outsiders who took the Democratic ballot in order to cast their ballots, and that there was all the sub issue here in West Virginia about the negativism towards Hillary Clinton's campaign, and many Democrats believe the best way to vote against Hillary Clinton was to support Bernie Sanders. But the fact of the matter is, Bernie Sanders did win the West Virginia primary, Democratic primary, and so it raises the question about whether, in fact, the superdelegates ought to be pledged to vote for the candidate who won the state. We had a little bit of a discussion about this last evening in our meeting, and there was one or two folks there who actually argued that the superdelegates are superdelegates because they know better what's best for the party and best for the nation than the voters. And I mean, you can go all the way back. And I did. I just sat there and reflected back to Madison's Federalist Number 10, in which Madison made the comment that there are a certain group of citizens, what he defined them as being quite unique, and basically suggested that they were better able to define the interests of the people than the people themselves. And traditionally, that's been a phrase or a clause in Federalist Number 10, which has drawn many people to conclude that Madison obviously was an elitist, and you can point to that statement to say that. We know, we've done quite a bit of analysis on Federalist Number 10 here at the Federalist Papers, and we learned that there's a lot more to it than that. That in essence, Madison, in Federalist Number 10, had laid out an educational process whereby those elected to represent the enlarged district, the enlarged congressional district, in Madison's thinking under the Constitution, would be those people, those politicos who had withstood a number of previous challenges and elections, to the point that these people in Madison's thinking would be devoid of local pressures and would be much better able to sit and reason and negotiate with their fellow colleagues, from representatives from other states, with the national interest or the public interest, if you will, as their priority. Madison had talked about this educational process, and we talked about it quite a bit here. There's no question that when Madison talks about the best and most virtuous citizens, whose wisdom and love of justice can best put aside local concerns in the interest of the public at large, he's talking about people who have been through this educational process and who do indeed focus their attention principally on the public interest and have, over time, learned to suppress the kind of local considerations which would interfere with their perception of the public interest. That's really what Madison was talking about. But be that as it may, if you take the words out of context, it clearly looks like Madison is being, extremely elitist here. And those were some of the comments that I heard last evening. And so there's no question that one of the issues that's going to come up at our state convention this weekend is the issue of superdelegates. There is a move in a number of states within the Democratic Party to eliminate the whole idea of superdelegates. By definition, it's not a very democratic concept. It seems to be a little bit contradictory to have something called superdelegates within the Democratic Party, the party of the people, so to speak. So I think there's a real issue here. It's a debate that I'm looking forward to experiencing and witnessing. And, who knows, maybe participate in. But anyway, I think it's a real issue. And many people were saying, well, the superdelegate principle, the idea of superdelegates does not go all the way back to the very beginning of the Republic. The fact of the matter is the idea of superdelegates emerged in the 1970s after the election of the election in which George McGovern was the recipient of an overwhelming defeat. As I recall, the only state that McGovern carried was Massachusetts. And I can remember seeing signs in Massachusetts which said basically, don't blame us, I'm from Massachusetts. Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts. In other words, the implication is that Massachusetts voted for McGovern. They were on the right track, and everybody else was wrong. But anyway, I used to enjoy seeing those. But the fact of the matter is, the concept of the principle of superdelegates was put in there in order to prevent a like situation in the future, where somebody on a whim or a fad or a temporary surge of passion, if you will, would seize the control and interest of the party and suddenly emerge with the nomination. The idea of superdelegates was to have off to the side a check to make sure that the leadership of the party never got too far off track. That was the principle. By definition, it's not very democratic. And I think a debate on whether the principle of superdelegates ought to be shelved or not in the future, I think, is significant. That's the long-term debate. The short-term debate is whether, in fact, a resolution ought to be passed at the state convention requiring all delegates to support the will of the people who voted for Bernie Sanders in this particular primary. I think that's another issue that's going to be a serious matter of debate. I think it says an awful lot. Then there is the question, Bob and I were chatting about this before we went on the air today. about the issue of Hillary Clinton's ability to recruit or to secure the support of the millions of voters who have supported Bernie Sanders. And my initial comment was that a lot of this is going to be contingent, at least at the beginning, on Bernie Sanders. How Bernie Sanders handles this issue and what he says to his followers, it seems to me, is going to play a critical role in how many of them are willing to go over and support Hillary Clinton. On the other hand, Bob pointed out, and I think rightly so, that the real burden of proof here is on Hillary. It's up to her to earn those votes, not just expect Bernie to deliver them. We're not talking about groceries here. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about educated human beings. And the fact of the matter is, when we're talking about those people that supported Bernie Sanders, we're really talking about, for the most part, young, vibrant, well-educated, thinking human beings. You don't just deliver those. You have to win them. And Bob's position is, and I totally agree with him, that a lot of her success in doing that is going to be on Hillary's shoulders. She just can't expect to do them, nor can she expect to get them only because she's not Donald Trump. Another issue that occurred yesterday, for those of you who stayed awake long enough to hear these speeches, Donald Trump's speech last evening in New York was quite an event. It was clearly the most scripted presentation I've heard Donald Trump ever make. He used teleprompters. It was a speech, apparently, from what the pundits said, that he participated in writing. But the fact of the matter is, it was obviously a speech directed primarily at the mainstream of the Republican Party, those people like Paul Ryan and Rich McConnell, who within the last 24 hours had taken to criticizing him for what they called racist comments against Judge Carrillo. And obviously, Donald Trump's presentation was clearly aimed at them when he basically said, "You can trust me, I won't let you down," blah, 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 and all that. So clearly, that was what was going on last night. On the other hand, as many of the pundits pointed out, and as I noticed in watching the speech, it really was not Donald Trump. I mean, it could have been anybody that gave that speech. But all the fire and the enthusiasm and the excitement in Trump's off-the-cuff speeches that draw so much attention and draw huge crowds was missing. Obviously, Donald had pretty much decided that the most important issue last night was to begin to mend fences with the mainstream of the Republican Party and not to risk going off script. So he didn't. It was constrained, it was controlled, it was unexciting, it was even boring. And one of the things I think that you can conclude at the end of this is when Donald Trump goes off, stops being Donald Trump, he can be pretty boring. I don't think he'd be pulling the kind of support that he's pulling if he used teleprompters all the time. In fact, in some of his previous speeches, he's made a big deal out of the fact that he does not do that. So I think that's significant as well. Finally, the third thing I wanted to say before we get back into our regular substance here at the Virtual Center today was the piece by Thomas Friedman in this morning's New York Times. Friedman called for the creation of a new Republican Party. But more specifically, he called on Republicans to distance themselves, to disavow Donald Trump and the comments that he's making. And Friedman even went to the point of dismissing those who refuse to disavow Donald Trump. One of the key ones, John McCain. John McCain is running for re-election in Arizona. He obviously is looking to be reelected. His own re-election obviously is a priority, is a major thing on his plate right now. Consequently, he has refused, he has not disavowed Donald Trump's comments. In fact, he has made every effort to try to justify them and justify his continued support for Donald Trump as the presumptive nominee and the frontrunner of the party. Tom Friedman's position is he ought to lose. He made the same statement about Marco Rubio, who had called, if you remember during the debates, had called Donald Trump a con artist. And yet when push came to shove, he made the decision to support the nominee no matter what. And Friedman's position is you can only push the idea that as however bad Trump might be, he's better than Hillary. You can only push that so far. And in fact, Friedman cites Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who makes that exact point. At some point in time, you got to get beyond this anybody's better than Hillary thing. And Graham's position is, no, that's not true. The things that Donald Trump said make him not better than Hillary. And so therefore, Graham reaffirmed his unwillingness to endorse Donald Trump as the leader, as the nominee of the Republican Party. Friedman's position is other leading Republicans need to be willing to do that as well. And if they're not, then what has to happen is that thinking, principled Republicans have to begin the process of building from scratch what he calls a new Republican Party, because the old one is broken beyond repair. I think Friedman doesn't say this in his article, but I think you could draw this conclusion from what he does say, at least I did. And that is that Donald Trump may not be the reason for the demise of the Republican Party that has existed for so long. Rather, he may be the product of a party that's in the process of disintegration. Friedman's position is that our two-party system requires a viable Republican alternative, a right-of-center alternative to offset the Democratic left-of-center alternative. Without that, not only is the Republican Party and all it stands for, theoretically, in trouble, but so also are the Democrats. In other words, these two parties in our system have become mutually interdependent upon each other. And when one of them becomes dysfunctional, as Friedman believes the current Republican Party is, then that affects the Democratic Party as well. And we'll have to see that. We'll have to see whether, in fact, that's true. In the past, what's happened is that when one party has become dysfunctional or doesn't really provide the kind of viable alternative that a two-party system suggests, then usually what happens is the other party begins to break up from within as well and seems to break into factions or self-interested groups within the mainstream of that party. So we'll have to see whether, in fact, that might happen to the Democrats as well. But Friedman's point is that it's time to build a new Republican Party. The question that I put on my posting on Facebook was the timing of this. It seems to me the Republicans, if they did indeed buy into Thomas Friedman's suggestion of the need for a new Republican Party, would need to decide when the best time would be to begin to initiate this. If the leadership began to do that now, if the main people who would lead in the creation of a new Republican Party would undertake the process right now, that would probably guarantee the defeat of Donald Trump in November. That might mean the demise of the Republican Party and its power in government. It probably would cost the Republican Party the control of the Senate. It might even begin to infringe on the number of majority votes that the Republicans currently have in the House of Representatives. In other words, if the leaders of the Republican Party began to build an alternative party now, that would probably dictate an overwhelming Democratic victory in the fall. But on the other hand, the other side of that would be the long-term benefits of rebuilding the Republican Party and grounding it or founding it on the principles which led to the creation of the Republican Party in the first place. So that has quite a bit going for it as well. In other words, it would be, in the short term, a political defeat. But in the long term, it probably could result in political success for a revamped, rebuilt Republican Party. The other alternative, of course, is to wait until November and see what happens in the elections of November 8th. If the Republicans lose that election, and then the leaders of the party begin to rebuild, that's a totally different scenario, because it's going to blend or blur the positive, creative parts of the rebuilding process with the devastation of having lost the November elections. In other words, it's one thing to initiate the creation process, the creative process, before the election, before the voters have spoken. If you do it afterwards and it's negative, it's going to look like desperation. And that could affect the outcome, the long-term outcome of how successful the rebuilding process would be. Again, those are just my thoughts. But at the same time, the reason I put this link on the Facebook page at all is because I think that Tom Friedman's piece is worth a read. Somebody I was talking to about it this morning made reference to the fact that, quote, Tom Friedman is my in-house progressive billionaire columnist. And, you know, I think we can take that for what it's worth. But the fact of the matter is, there are times that I found over the years when Friedman's insight and wisdom really comes shining through. And I think it did in this one. I think there are many Friedman columns in the past on any number of issues where it's a little bit hard sometimes at the end to really figure out exactly where he stands on the issues. He's very, very adept at kind of walking the middle road, so to speak, on a lot of issues. On this one this morning, I thought it was pretty encouraging coming from him. He's very reputable, he's very well read. Therefore, his ideas are going to be digested and reflected upon by a number of prominent people. If anybody is going to be able to pull off the building of a new Republican Party, it's Tom Friedman. So, again, I really believe that this particular piece is worth a read for the content it provides. And I wanted to take the opportunity to put that on Facebook and share it with you. Well, those are the three issues that I wanted to open our program with today. And of course, that's pretty much takes care of 25% of our time together today. But that leaves us a significant portion of our Wednesday time together to get into some of the real issues that we've been dwelling or focusing upon here in the Virtual Center. And the issue that I'd like to begin with is the issue that caused me to run over yesterday and lose track of the time. And again, I do apologize for that. I'm usually a little bit more tuned in than that. But again, I guess Bob Kincaid's comment was, and I appreciated him saying this, that it was obvious that I was really into this to the point that I lost track of the time. And that's kind of true. But I appreciate his willingness to acknowledge that and to recognize it and then to acknowledge it and give me the benefit of the doubt, so to speak. What we were talking about yesterday, if you remember, was the issue of the kinds of circumstances or situations which produce efforts at some sort of revolution within this country. Our textbooks have always preached, have always bragged about the fact that one of the things that makes America politically quite different than other democracies, if you will, is that we have not experienced the kind of revolution that many other nations have played. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Spanish Revolution, etc. The fact of the matter is, that doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't there or that the makings of them weren't there. And one of the things you find is that if you dig deeply enough, there's evidence that these kinds of things have happened. There's no question that in the Western world, in the midst of the so-called Great Depression, after the fall of the stock market in the United States in 1929, in October of 1929, our economy, as well as the economy of the rest of the developed world, plunged into a recession, the depths of which hadn't been realized before in the Western world. And I think we've acknowledged before, in many places, this led people to begin to think in extreme terms. More specifically, many people here in America as well as elsewhere began to question the viability of capitalism itself. Because after 4 years of Herbert Hoover, it didn't appear that government was able to do anything to stem the recession. And again, Hoover has been criticized because ethically and intellectually, ideologically, he could go further than anybody else, but he couldn't go far enough in initiating government action to stem the tide of this recession. It was that deep. But many people, many intellectuals began to question whether, in fact, what this meant was that many of the radicals in the world, many of the critics, the communists and the socialists and the others, were right. Maybe capitalism was doomed. Maybe capitalism was not the be-all and end-all of the best for mankind forever. And many nations, as we know, began to seek security by following leaders, strong authoritarian type leaders. And we had in the 1930s, in the late 20s and 1930s, the birth of fascism throughout the world. And of course we know the major one's Adolf Hitler. We also know that Benito Mussolini in Italy. We also know with the Russian Revolution earlier in the 20th century, Russia had moved through the Communist Revolution and had turned to the strong leader as well in the person of Joseph Stalin. We know that the nation of Japan as well, was moving towards support. In their case, the support for the military, for a military takeover of the country, and the rendering of the emperor as a virtual figurehead. Many people in this country saw FDR, saw Roosevelt, and the New Deal ideas he was running his campaign on in 1932 as our version of fascism. Many people saw Roosevelt as the same kind of fascist alternative that became very attractive to a nation that knew it was in trouble. And this issue, this movement that we were talking about yesterday, is a product of that mentality in that period. I mentioned Smedley Butler, the retired Brigadier General of the Marine Corps. In testimony before a House committee, the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, Smedley Butler testified that he had been approached to lead a coup, a military takeover designed to overthrow Roosevelt before his administration became too deeply planted in Washington. The ruse or the excuse was going to be that Roosevelt's health was failing. Smedley Butler testified that he had been promised an army of up to 500,000 troops for this takeover. What we didn't do yesterday was get into the specifics of the fact that Smedley Butler, in his testimony, named names. He named many of the people that he knew, that he had been told, were intricately involved in this revolutionary effort. And many of them were not only prominent military leaders, they were prominent corporate leaders as well. They were prominent financial and political as well as religious leaders. And one of the things we did conclude in our program yesterday, we did address, was the fact, and I'm want to get my hands on my paperwork here for purposes of discussion. One of the things we did recognize or realize yesterday is that Congress decided that many of the names that Smedley Butler mentioned were very prestigious, prominent people. And the committee declined to call these people to testify, mainly because their names came up in testimony before this House committee. In other words, some members of Congress said that they were not comfortable calling prominent, important people to Washington to appear before a committee based on hearsay. And so the fact of the matter is, with the exception of Gerald C. McGuire, who had been a bond salesman for Grayson Murphy and Company and a member of the Connecticut American Legion. He was Smedley Butler's contact. He was the direct source for many of the names that Smedley Butler released to the committee. McGuire was called to testify, but except for Smedley Butler and Gerald McGuire, none of the others mentioned in Butler's testimony were called. I spent a little bit of time this morning on some of the names that Butler mentioned. I thought I would share a couple of them with you just to get some idea of who these people were and how prominent they were, because I think it gives us a flavor of where this movement, this coup idea, might have come from if indeed it happened. And the fact of the matter is, many of the nation's most prominent publications, including the New York Times, editorialized and called the issue a humongous hoax, that there was no such plan afoot. The fact of the matter is, the committee later mentioned that it had been able to verify much of what Smedley Butler had said. Clearly, there was a temptation or an inclination among members of Congress at this time to sweep a lot of this under the rug and hope that it would go away. And as we know, it did. Which makes, it seems to me, the issue even more intriguing. One of the names that Smedley Butler mentioned was John W. Davis. Turns out that John W. Davis was from West Virginia. He was a prominent attorney. He was a corporate attorney. He had been elected as a representative in the House of Delegates from the state of West Virginia and served from 1909 until 1913, 2 terms in the House of Representatives. He was appointed as Solicitor General. Many of you will recall that he actually was a candidate for President of the United States in the 20s against Harding. He lost the election to Warren G. Harding. One of the things that I found particularly interesting about John W. Davis was that his father had been a delegate at the Wheeling Convention in the mid-1860s, and as many of us know, the Wheeling Convention in 1866, I believe, early 1860s, was instrumental in creating the state of West Virginia, carving the state of West Virginia out of the state of Virginia. And West Virginia statehood is dated at 1863. So the Wheeling Convention led to that, and John Davis's father was involved in that effort. Another name that Smedley Butler mentioned was General Hugh Johnson. General Johnson was a prominent military man. Another was General Harbord. A fourth name, Thomas W. Lamont. Thomas W. Lamont was CEO for J.P. Morgan Company, which was the major Wall Street financial firm at the time and still is. Admiral Sims, retired Admiral of the Navy. Congress did not call these people, but they were prominent people. Hugh Johnson, for example, became very active in the New Deal program. He was the main person behind the creation of the NRA, the National Recovery Act, in the early 1930s in Roosevelt's program. He was one of the people that Smedley Butler named as having been in on this projected coup. It suggests then that a very liberal, progressive agenda, as being touted by FDR, by the Democrats in the early 1830s, as the most effective, likely avenue to get us out of the Depression, bordered on socialism and communism to many of these people, and they felt, as patriots and as prominent members, prominent leaders in the United States, that they should do something about Roosevelt. I think that's very, very significant. It ties in with this whole idea of a corporate ethic. We talked about this when we were looking at Joel Bakken's study of corporations. And Bakken's position that corporations are driven by the same kinds of characteristics as are psychopaths. They are driven by a set of priorities which can never vary. Therefore, Bakken argues, corporations need to be regulated. They need government direction and control, oversight, because they can't be trusted to self-regulate. So this raises the issue of the regulation of corporations, the legitimacy of the right of corporations to be regulated. And lo and behold, where in recent history does all of this issue of regulating corporations come to a head, but in the issues and cases leading up to the 2010 Citizens United case? A major issue in that decision, the majority decision in Citizens United, written by Justice Antonin Scalia, and the 90-page dissenting opinion of Justice Stevens, John W. Stevens, raises the issue as a major part of the argument of each, the issue of government's legitimate right to regulate corporations. More specifically, running headlong into the issue of corporate personhood. We'll recall that we looked earlier, last week's program specifically, at the John Marshall decision in Dartmouth College versus Woodward over the issue of corporations and what Marshall's definition of a corporation is. And what we saw was that Marshall had stated in Dartmouth College that by definitions, corporations must be given two specific properties in order to fulfill their obligations to the government which chartered them. And those two properties are the right to immortality and the right to individuality. And what we talked about here in previous programs, last week and earlier this week, is the idea that when you look at immortality and individualism together, and you begin to consider or reflect on how they interact and interdepend one upon the other, you begin to get a fairly clear picture of the fact that what Marshall is doing is granting corporations the kind of independence and flexibility they would need in order to care for their own immortality, their own future, that would deny or make it difficult for government to justify continuing regulation of them. In other words, the issue on the table Marshall is talking about is the issue of the unique nature of corporations and the extent to which corporations are legal persons. They are created by the law for very specific purposes. As such, they are to be treated by the law as if a corporation made up of many individuals was in fact one individual. And from that stems the idea of corporate personhood. So the issue before the court in 2010 in the Citizens United case relates to the legitimacy of government's right to regulate corporations. Again, let me lay out the context for this, because we're right at the top of our first hour, and I think we're at a perfect place in a minute or two to have our 5-minute break and to launch into this in our second hour. The context here is Barkan's argument that corporations as psychopaths must be regulated, cannot be trusted to self-regulate. That immediately raises the question of whether, in fact, corporations can be regulated by government, or whether, in fact, their legal status as persons makes them immune from regulation and leaves society no other option except self-regulation. That's the issue that Stevens raises in his dissent. He bases a major part of his dissenting opinion on the fact that from the very beginning, the framers believed that corporations needed to be and ought to be regulated by government. Scalia, Justice Scalia, takes Stevens on in his concurring opinion in Citizens United and denies this reading of the framers' intent at the time that the First Amendment was passed. And of course, what we're talking about here in Scalia's mind is the idea of the First Amendment and the idea specifically of the freedom of speech. His position being that if corporations are indeed legal persons, then they are entitled to the same rights as other persons. And one of them is free speech. And if you look at previous Supreme Court decisions, like the Valeo decision in the 1990s, you begin to recognize that the court has established financial contributions to candidates as a form of political speech. Therefore, if you deny the right of corporations to contribute to political campaigns, then you are denying them the right to First Amendment freedom of speech. So the issue of the right to regulate corporations, it seems to me, is a critical factor in this whole issue. When we come back after our 5-minute break, I would like to address Scalia's argument and address Stevens's dissent against that major majority argument in Citizens United. Because I think ultimately we have got to reach some sort of a conclusion about the issue of the right of government to regulate corporations. Because as Barkan tells us, if you don't, then they will, under the guise of self-regulation, use the freedom and the lack of government control to feather their own nests. In other words, they will be out of control because innately they are psychopathic, and therefore they must be controlled. As Barkan says, just as you would no longer trust a psychopath to self-regulate, likewise, you can't trust corporations to do that either. Let's pause and take our 5-minute break. We've gone a little bit beyond the top of the hour. It's a couple of minutes after the top of the hour, but we're not bad. We're still in good shape. We've got the better part of an hour to address this issue. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Short 5-minute break, and we'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid. I've been sitting here listening to the music and enjoying it. It was very, very nice. Welcome back to our second hour here on this Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Wednesday, the 8th day of June in the year 2016, and it is an absolutely gorgeous day here, and I trust that you're enjoying the day from where you're listening as well. Let me share with you our phone number. We do invite your calls and your comments. I kind of expect that there might be a comment or two related to the Smedley Butler issue and the projected coup that Smedley Butler was involved in and kind of blew the whistle on before the House Committee in 1934, 1935. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me that way, waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And again, I do invite you to share our Facebook page and to use the opportunity to make comments and to give some feedback, some reaction to it. If you go to Facebook and you go to the search box at the top of the homepage, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be into our Facebook page. In our first hour, for those of you just joining us, we talked on a number of issues related to yesterday's election, the Donald Trump issue, the relationship between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and the extent to which Bernie's followers will or will not move over easily to support Hillary's candidacy, and whether in fact that imposes some responsibility on Hillary. We also looked at Tom Friedman's piece in today's New York Times on the time being ripe for the building of a new Republican Party and his desire to abandon and get rid of the remnants of the existent one because it has become so ideological that it has become dysfunctional. And then finally, we returned to our program yesterday talking about the projected or the presumed coup that existed in the 1934 period against Theodore Roosevelt and his New Deal program. And we mentioned some of the names mentioned as being involved in planning that coup by Smedley Butler, retired Brigadier General of the Marine Corps, in his testimony before the House Committee chaired by John McCormick of Massachusetts and Representative Dick Steen. And I don't know which state, to be honest with you, Dick Steen represents at this point. I didn't really take time to look that up. What we did at the very end of the hour as the lead into this one is we returned to the issue of the regulation of corporations. Whether in fact corporations, corporate behavior can be and should be regulated by government. And what we saw was that this issue of corporate regulation on the one hand versus corporate immunity from such regulation on the other had come up as a major factor in the 2010 decision in Citizens United. We know, looking back all the way back to John Marshall, about the origins of corporate personhood. John Marshall's argument that corporations were legal creations of the law, but as such, they would treat the corporations comprised of many individuals as if, in fact, the corporation was one individual. In a sense, granting corporations the right of personhood under the law. Later on in the nation's history, as we move more and more towards the present, that issue of corporate personhood, which is reinforced after the Civil War with the 14th Amendment, that issue becomes a key ingredient in efforts to assign rights to corporations heretofore reserved only for human beings. The argument being that if under the law a corporation is a person, then it is entitled to the same rights as people have under the Bill of Rights. More specifically, under the First Amendment, the right to the freedom of speech and freedom of the press as well. And that becomes a basis for the majority opinion in Citizens United, which grants corporations under the heading, under the rubric, if you will, of corporate speech or political speech, the right to pour millions of dollars into our political campaign process. And we are seeing that right now, and we know that there is a significant movement afoot in the nation to undo or overturn the court's decision in Citizens United. The debate in that case between the majority concurring opinion of Antonin Scalia on the one hand, and the dissenting opinion, which extended for 90 pages by Justice John Paul Stevens, is what we wanted to devote this final hour of our program today, namely the issue of corporate regulation. Because one of the issues that Stevens makes in his dissent is that from the very beginning, the founders established a separate category for corporations. The founders did not accept the fact that corporations ought to be treated and ought to have the same rights as individual persons, as human beings. As we know, Stevens's opinion, Stevens's dissent was to challenge the majority 5-4 opinion in Citizens United, granting corporations the rights to unlimited political contributions as long as they didn't go directly to the candidate, but they could go to groups, organizations like political action committees, which would use the money theoretically for political education. I'm reading a couple of excerpts, a couple of paragraphs from Justice Stevens' dissenting opinion in order to suggest Stevens's view as to the basis for the majority opinion in Citizens United. Stevens says the following: in the end, the court's rejection of Austin and McConnell, these were two Supreme Court cases, the first one in 1990, the second one in 2003, and I call your attention to the name McConnell because, yes, it is Mitch McConnell in 2003. And in those two cases, the court upheld the legitimacy of campaign finance controls, legislation to limit the amount of money that could be contributed into our political campaigns. That becomes the basis of Citizens United, because the argument is that those limits on campaign spending violate the corporation's right as a legal person to freedom of speech. And that's the basis of Scalia's majority concurring opinion. So Stevens makes the point that in the end, the court's rejection of Austin and McConnell, which he points out was critical to the majority opinion in Citizens United, came down to what he called nothing more than its disagreement with their results. His argument was, Stevens's dissenting opinion argues, that in order to render the decision that the majority wanted to make in Citizens United, they had to overturn both Austin and McConnell, because those two decisions justified the right of corporations to limit, the right of government to limit corporate contribution, political contributions, and in order to prevent corruption in our political system, to support or to pass campaign finance regulation. Stevens's argument is that in order to reach the agreement they wanted in Citizens United, they had to overturn those two decisions. But his argument is that they didn't overturn them because they found anything wrong with them. They merely overturned them because they didn't like their results. The only relevant thing, he says, that has changed since Austin and McConnell is the composition of this court. Today's ruling thus strikes at the vitals of stare decisis, quote, the means by which we ensure that the law will not be merely change erratically, but will develop in a principled and intelligible fashion that permits society to presume that bedrock principles are founded in the law rather than in the proclivities of individuals, unquote. In other words, what Stevens is saying here is that what the court has done in Citizens United is overturn two previous decisions, not because they were wrong, but because the court's makeup had changed. And now there was a conservative majority on the court, and they wanted to grant these rights to contribute to political campaigns to corporations, and the only way they could do it was to overturn Austin and McConnell. Then he goes into specifically a criticism of the court's decision in Citizens United. The novelty of the court's procedural dereliction and its approach to stare decisis is matched by the novelty of its ruling on its merits. The ruling rests on several premises. 1. The court claims that Austin and McConnell have banned corporate speech. Stevens is going to argue that corporations never had speech. Second, the court's ruling claims that the First Amendment precludes regulatory distinctions based on speaker identity, including the speaker's identity as a corporation. In other words, the second premise of Citizens United, Stevens says, is that the majority is going to argue or wants the court to accept the fact that the First Amendment precludes the right to regulate speaker identity, including the speaker's identity as a corporation. And third, the decision claims that Austin and McConnell were radical outliers in our First Amendment traditions and our campaign finance jurisprudence. What Stevens argues is that actually this decision is the outlier, not Austin and McConnell, which it overturned. Again, what Stevens is arguing is that the court is making a decision it wants to make, not a decision that the law mandates that it must make. If you take that out of context a little bit, it suggests very clearly that what Stevens is accusing the majority, conservative majority of in Citizens United is judicial activism. The court is making law. The court is overturning decisions which deny corporations the right to make unlimited contributions, political contributions. The court obviously wants to give corporations those rights, and in order to do that, it is manipulating previous decisions in order to justify that action. Therefore, the court is making law. It is guilty of judicial activism. In his dissenting opinion, which, as I mentioned, extends for 90 pages, Stevens has a significant portion of that opinion on America's First Amendment traditions, what the First Amendment is really all about. This seems to me to be the basis of our focus today. Stevens says, a third fulcrum of the court's opinion is the idea that Austin and McConnell are radical outliers or aberrations in our First Amendment traditions. And then he said, the fact of the matter is the court has it backwards. It is today's holding that is the radical departure. From what had been First Amendment law. And then Stephen goes back to the original understandings of the founders at the time that the First Amendment was written and approved, 1791. He says basically that when you go back and look at the thinking, the understandings of those who drafted and ratified the First Amendment, there is not a scintilla of evidence to support the notion that anyone believed it would preclude regulatory distinctions based on the corporate form, unquote. What Justice Stevens is saying is there is nothing in the evidence, nothing in the research surrounding the formulation of the First Amendment, not a scintilla of evidence that suggests that anyone at the time of the founding believed that the First Amendment would deny government the right to regulate corporations and regulate corporation speech. Nothing. To the extent that the framers' views are discernible and relevant to the disposition of this case, Stevens said, they would appear to cut strongly against the majority's position. Translation, what Stevens is saying is that all the evidence suggests that there is nothing about the First Amendment to indicate that this in any way interfered or was intended to interfere with government's right to regulate corporate behavior. What Stevens is going to make the case for is that at the time of the founding, governments regularly regulated corporations, and that it's the decisions of the courts afterwards, especially recently, that has limited government's right to regulate corporations, and especially in the area of free speech. Basically, what Justice Stevens argues is, quote, it was assumed that corporations were legally privileged organizations that had to be closely scrutinized by the legislature because their purposes had to be made consistent with public welfare, unquote. That's a key point in Stevens's dissent. It was assumed at the time of the founding that corporations, because they were chartered by government, were legally privileged organizations that had to be closely scrutinized, closely watched, closely regulated by the legislature in order to make sure that the corporation's behavior was consistent with public welfare. It was realized at the time, Stevens is arguing, that corporations were profit-making ventures. They were organizations created for the purpose of amassing capital by attracting investors. Their purpose was profit. And the only way that these profit-driven organizations could be made to adhere to the public interest, to be required to act in ways consistent with the public welfare, was to regulate them. Stevens is arguing that was generally accepted at the time of the founding. Here is a quote from a study. Let me be more specific. This is Friedman's History of American Law, and it's based in part on opinions written by Justice Brandeis. Quote, the word soulless constantly recurs in debates over corporations. Corporations, it was feared, could concentrate the worst urges of whole groups of men. They had to be regulated because they were considered to be soulless, without souls, without conscience, psychopaths. That's basically the conclusion that Friedman reaches in his History of American Law, written in 1985. Let me go on with Justice Stevens. The framers thus took it as a given that corporations could be comprehensively regulated in the service of the public welfare. Unlike our colleagues, in other words, the conservative majority of the court. Unlike our colleagues, they had little trouble, the founders, had little trouble distinguishing corporations from human beings. And when they constitutionalized the right to free speech in the First Amendment, it was the free speech of individual Americans that they had in mind. While individuals might join together to exercise their speech rights, business corporations, at least, were plainly not seen as facilitating such associational or expressive ends, unquote. The framers believed that the First Amendment protected the free speech of individuals. There was no mention, there was nothing to indicate that this didn't include groups of people who got together to express their free speech. But there was also general agreement that business corporations were not considered part of the free speech initiative. And then they quote John Marshall in Dartmouth College versus Woodward. We looked at this before. A corporation is an artificial being, invisible, intangible, and existing only in contemplation of law. Being the mere creature of law, it possesses only those properties, which the charter of its creation confers upon it, unquote, said John Marshall. The implication is clear, and that's what Stevens quotes it for. The implication is that corporations only have the rights which are granted to them in their charters. Therefore, by definition, by implication, government has the right to make sure that corporations do not try to seize more rights than their charter gives them. In other words, if corporations are limited in their rights to what's in the charters, then the implication is that government has the right to hold corporations to the charter. That means that government regulation of corporations is a given, according to Stevens. He says, it seems to me implausible that the framers believed the freedom of speech would extend equally to all corporate speakers, much less that it would preclude legislatures from taking limited measures to guard against corporate capture of elections. What Stevens is saying is, under these circumstances, under these general assumptions at the time that corporations could be regulated, it doesn't make sense that corporations would be granted rights under the First Amendment which would free them from government oversight and allow them to use that freedom to benefit themselves. That, Stevens believed, was inconceivable. He goes on and says, it seems absurd to think that the First Amendment prohibits legislatures from taking into account the corporate identity of a sponsor of electoral advocacy. As a matter of original meaning, it likewise seems baseless. And then Justice Stevens, in his dissent, takes on Justice Scalia. He says, Justice Scalia criticizes the foregoing discussion for failing to adduce statements from the founding era showing that corporations were understood to be excluded from the First Amendment's free speech guarantees. Stevens is criticizing Scalia because Scalia is alleging that unless you can find evidence that the founders specifically excluded corporations from free speech rights under the First Amendment, then therefore Scalia is arguing you must assume that corporations were not excluded. In other words, he's putting the burden on the minority. If you believe that corporations are denied the First Amendment rights of free speech, Scalia is saying, you got to find something that shows that to me. You got to prove that. In the absence of proof, we, the majority, choose to believe that corporations do indeed have First Amendment rights. Therefore, if they do, then any legislative effort to limit those rights under legislation like McCain-Feingold, for example, which minimizes campaign contributions, is a violation of corporate rights under the First Amendment. That's Scalia's argument. Justice Stevens argues that that doesn't make sense. It absolutely doesn't make sense. Stevens says nothing in Scalia's account dislodges my basic point that members of the founding generation held a cautious view of corporate power and a narrow view of corporate rights. If no prominent framer bothered to articulate that corporate speech would have lesser status than individual speech, that may well be because the contrary proposition, if not also the very notion of corporate speech, was inconceivable. What Stevens is arguing in response to Scalia is that that's a specious argument that Scalia is making. Scalia is saying if you can't find evidence that corporations are denied free speech, then we presume it is. We presume that they have it. What Stevens is saying is the reason there is no evidence that corporations ought to be denied free speech is because there was never a consideration at that time that they ever should have it. In other words, it was inconceivable. The reason they didn't mention it as being denied to corporations is because there was a general assumption that corporations didn't have it anyway. So why would they mention it? That's Stevens' argument. There's one more part to this issue that Scalia raises that I would like to mention. We're moving towards it's 20 minutes to the hour, so we've got less than 20 minutes left in our program. There's one more major piece of Justice Scalia's concurring opinion that I believe it is vital that we consider. I now have in my hand a copy of Scalia's concurring opinion. And as Stevens mentioned, Scalia makes the point that if you can't find evidence that corporations were denied free speech by the founders, then we have to presume that they were granted it. That's what Scalia's argument. That is a facetious argument, and that's the argument that Justice Stevens takes on. But there's one more part of Scalia's argument that I think is critical, because the fact of the matter is, it is a major basis of the whole majority finding in Citizens United. Scalia says, quote, "It is the speech of many individual Americans who have associated in a common cause, giving the leadership of the party the right to speak on their behalf." Scalia's argument is Republican Party and Democratic Party are both comprised of large numbers of individuals. Clearly, they have free speech. So what Scalia is arguing is there's nothing to indicate that because these people have associated into political parties, their right to speak ought to be denied. The association of individuals in a business corporation, Scalia says, is no different. Or at least it cannot be denied the right to speak on the simplistic ground that it's not an individual American. Scalia's argument is if a Democratic Party and a Republican Party made up of groups of individuals can be expected to have free speech, then it stands to reason that so should business corporations, Scalia argues. Then I think he drops the bomb. This is the key issue. Scalia says, but to return to and summarize my principal point, which is the conformity of today's opinion with the original meaning of the First Amendment. The amendment is written in terms of speech, not speakers, unquote. That becomes the basis of Citizens United. The First Amendment is not written in terms of the speaker in free speech situations, but the speech. What Scalia is arguing, and it really requires that we reflect upon it because this is critical, is that the First Amendment doesn't protect the speaker's right to free speech. The First Amendment addresses principally the speech itself. Here, as I understand it, is Scalia's thinking. If the First Amendment deals with free speech, and it's the speech rather than the speaker that is the focus of the First Amendment, then what that means is that no limitations on speech in any sense can be permitted. Scalia is arguing here that the debate over corporations not having the same rights as individuals have is really not the way to go. That really is not what the First Amendment's all about. What the First Amendment is all about, Scalia says, is protecting speech. What that means is protecting the idea of the marketplace of ideas. It's based on the assumption that the best decisions are going to be the product of open discussion, open negotiation, and open debate. Therefore, everybody's contribution to that process has value. And in order to get to the best result, in order to have the best chance at coming closest to the truth, it's important that no speech be excluded, irrespective of who makes it. What that means is that it's to protect the marketplace of ideas that in Citizens United, the majority of the court chose to grant corporations the right to unlimited political contributions in our political campaigns. If freedom of speech is about the pursuit of truth, and if truth is the product of everybody who has something to contribute to make that contribution, then Scalia's thinking is that it would jeopardize the pursuit of truth itself to deny corporations the right to free speech. Thus, his argument that the First Amendment is not about the speaker, it's about the speech. Once you accept Scalia's rationale, once you accept his way of thinking, then what that means is no limitations anywhere by anyone on anyone can be permitted. By linking the First Amendment to speech directly, what you are doing is denying the right of government to regulate corporate behavior, to regulate the behavior or the rights of any individuals to speak, to contribute to the marketplace of ideas and the pursuit of truth. Because to allow that would skew the evidence. It would take away a major part of the contribution to the search for truth. Therefore, if what freedom of speech is the pursuit of truth, then everybody's speech must be included. Therefore, what Scalia has done is turn the First Amendment to the benefit of corporate persons. I've thought a lot about this, because this is really what Citizens United is about. It protects free speech. It protects financial contributions as political speech. But the key is protecting the speech, not the speaker. If you are familiar with the First Amendment, and I hope you are, the First Amendment says that Congress will pass no law infringing upon the freedom of speech or of the press. Let's take Scalia's rationale and apply it to freedom of the press. We know that the history of freedom of the press in this issue, in this nation, relates to the issue of censorship. We know that the court's entire history in free press cases have focused on minimizing or eliminating censorship, so that everybody who publishes has the right to publish. Fact of the matter is, Scalia mentions this in his concurring opinion. Newspapers are published by corporations, by publishing corporations. They have the right to free speech, Scalia argues. How can you limit it? How can you limit free speech and still grant them the right to freedom of the press? His argument is both of them are, the way the amendment is written, both of them are the same. All right, let's take Scalia's rationale in Citizens United that the First Amendment on speech protects speech, not the speaker. If you take that same reasoning and apply it to the freedom of the press, then what Scalia would be saying is that the freedom of the press in the First Amendment protects not the right of the newspaper to publish, Rather, it protects what's published. It seems to me that if you apply that logic, then you get into some trouble. Because the fact of the matter is, we have liability laws. People can be sued for what they put in print. People are liable for what they print. In effect, if it was the print, what's published, that was protected, rather than the right of the newspaper to publish it, then there would be no limitations, no liability associated with it at all. Everybody would have the right to publish anything they wanted about anybody they wanted to say it about. Because the theory, Scalia's rationale would be, the most important thing is to get it out there. We know that that's not true. We know that the publisher is liable, is responsible for what he publishes. Therefore, there is a form of regulation permitted under freedom of the press. Scalia is denying that same right of regulation to freedom of speech. I don't believe that he's on solid ground. I really believe that Scalia's reasoning in Citizens United is an example of judicial activism. He wants to grant corporations the maximum rights of personhood under the First Amendment. And he basically finds a way to do it. But more important, he's able to get a majority of the court, a 5-4 majority, to go along with him. So where are we as we kind of wind up our program together, because we're at 54 minutes after the hour. We got about 4 minutes left in our program. Where have we come? Chris Matthews, at the end of his program each night, says, what have we learned today? What have we learned from this discussion? It seems to me that we haven't learned anything that would deny Joel Bakken's argument that corporations are indeed driven by the characteristics of psychopaths. That corporations are driven by a set of priorities that basically render them immune to regulatory control, to social control. They claim the right to self-regulation because that's the only way they can hope to prevent political regulation. But the fact of the matter is, I think the argument is specious. I don't think, personally, that the argument holds water. I have trouble dismissing or rejecting Bakken's argument. Corporations will not do what they should do unless they are forced to. I think Stevens makes the case that at the time of the founding, at the time the First Amendment was drafted, Americans generally were very negative and very suspicious of corporations. The corporations that they had seen were government-created entities that were given all sorts of special privileges and all sorts of special rights to exploit society for their own benefits. They had a very negative view of corporations. Why would these people concede First Amendment freedoms to corporations? I can't help but accept Stevens's rationale. The reason that there is not hard evidence that the founders wanted corporations to not have the right to free speech was because that issue at the time, given the attitude towards corporations, was not even considered. It never even came up. It wasn't even a thought. It did not exist. Consequently, I believe that the issue of regulating corporations is critical. I don't believe we can afford to go along with this idea that we can trust corporations to self-regulate. It's mystical. It's mythical. It's a dream that they will do it. Of course, the irony is it's no more a dream than is the free market itself. The fact that people will pursue their own self-interest, and the sum total of everyone pursuing their own self-interest is the public interest, I think is a myth. Where I think this whole discussion has credibility, I think where the real substance lies in the fact that if you take this particular issue, you are able to see or to glean the rationale for free enterprise capitalism itself. And you begin to realize how specious the argument in favor of that is by looking at how specious this argument is. I really believe that. Anyway, we have reached the end of our program. We're at 59 minutes after the hour. I want to make sure we get out of here on time today. I want to thank you for tuning into the Virtual Center. This is pretty heady stuff. I understand that. It's a little bit complicated and a little bit difficult. But I really encourage you to look at Citizens United, look at Stevens's dissent, see what you think. For the Virtual Center, for Bob Kincaid and the Hit On Radio Network, I want to thank you for your support. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we'll get together the first of next week. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so very, very much for listening.